Afternoon, everybody. Last week, those of you who were here and who were brave enough or stupid enough to come back for a second dose, we'll really talk very much about the development of the corporation from the 17th century and the services that they were providing. And I suppose one of the things that I hope to sort of put across in that talk was that gradually during the 19th century, the corporation or the council, whatever you want to call it, was increasingly coming into contact with people's daily lives in terms of services that were providing and the role that the corporation was playing in this development generally. And that really reaches a climax in the late second half of the 19th century. Belfast, I'm not going to go over the history of Belfast, but in a couple of sentences, most of you all know that in Belfast in 1800 had a population of 20,000 people. 1840 a population of 70,000, and by 1900 a population of 350,000. Massive population growth during the 19th century from a very small town essentially to a large city. That was based on industry, heavy industry. Probably the best example of which is just out the windows in the shipyard, but all heavy industry as well. And at this time, Belfast was one of the fastest growing cities in Europe. It became the bigger in terms of total population in Dublin in the 1880s. Something they were always very conscious of was comparing the population of the two cities. And Belfast's place in the world as an international city was starting to take effect as well. Now the Town Council, which had been created in 1840, met in rooms that they rented initially, and then we were talking about building a purpose-built town hall. That's really where I want to start today, sort of the home of the corporation and the home of the City Council. And this building here we have a picture of it was now known as the Old Town Hall. But of course when it was built between 1869 and 1871 in Victoria Street, it was the Town Hall. We come to know it as the Old Town Hall. Built for a sum of £16,000 and to the designs of an architect called Anthony Jackson. And nearly as soon as it's opened in 1871, in fact slightly before it's opened, there's controversy about this building. I suppose on a humorous note, there's well, we think it's humorous now, controversy about the design of it. Originally it was supposed to have parapets around the top, and of course there was a campaign that no self-respecting public building would appear in Victorian times without a parapet around the top. But that's really the fun bit of it, I suppose. The more serious bit was that there were people that were saying that this town hall is not big enough, grand enough, to reflect the increasingly growing Belfast in terms of its population, in terms of its industry, and in terms of its place in the world. Like, sometimes those of us who work in the council start to believe our own propaganda, and we say Belfast is buzzing and all this sorts of stuff. Belfast is certainly better than it was, but it's not quite back to the position in the world that it held, in 1900 when it was a world city in terms of industry and one thing or another. And also because the corporation, in terms of the services provided, was impacting on people's lives. It was also that it wasn't just big enough for the corporation. And I would go one step further. There's not a lot of evidence to support that. But when you remember that the city fathers were people like Edward Harland, you might also go a step further and say that maybe it wasn't grand enough for some of the people who at that time were the city fathers. Like I said, quite easily today, the Lord Mayor might be here next week, but some of these people were world figures in their own right. Perry, who's been a big influence on the design of City Hall. These are men of international standing. They built an international liners. Maybe they wanted a City Hall that reflected not only what they were building in terms of industry, but also their own position in the world as well. There's a photograph inside that Old Town Hall in Victoria Street. That's quite an illustrious career in its own right. I've done some research on it, but the various uses it was put after during the road crisis, with the headquarters of the Ulster Unionist Council, the old UUF. Then used by the Northern Ministry of Education and now as part of the court service. But those of you who know the current City Hall will recognise some of the portraits as being in the main room still in City Hall. And this table here is what is this was the council table. The council was much smaller then. Is the table that's in the robing room of the City Hall at the moment. And I suppose where Belfast was and the big drive for the building of the City Hall, I suppose is summed up in one document. It's this one here, which is the charter from Queen Victoria making Belfast a city. To give it the right phrase, the dignity of a city. We always call it the status of a city, but in those days they talked about the dignity of the city. In 1888, it's on display in the foyer of the City Hall. I always joke with my Presbyterian colleagues that Belfast could have been back to fact a city before 1888, but before the city fathers allowed the officials to apply for the dignity of becoming a city. They made absolutely sure it wasn't going to cost anymore to become the privilege of becoming a city. So, as the City Council was done in the Presbyterians, I like to point this out to their co-religionists. And this slide of the gasworks is supposed to be reflects, there's a couple of things really, reflects, you know, the increasing effect of the municipal authority on people's lives, the role it was playing. Remember from last week, they bought over the gasworks in the 1870s. The other reason, of course, is that if you read a lot of the standard histories, you will see that they say the City Hall was built from the profits of the gasworks. And that is nearly right. It was largely built from the profits of the gaswork. There was other money put into it as well, including public money that they got by the whole inquiry after that. But it's just, you know, looking at the impact, the council wasn't just, or the corporation wasn't just for the building of City Hall. It was, you know, increasingly municipal life, the role of the city and the role of people's lives in the city. And the City Hall should be seen as a product of that, but also a product of where Belfast was in terms of its positioning within the world. Turning to the site of where the current City Hall is in Donegal Square. I know I'm probably talking to an audience who knows a lot of this, but I have to go through it. Originally, that site was the gardens of Belfast Castle. Of course, I'm not talking about the Belfast Castle of the Cave Hill, I'm talking about the Belfast Castle that stood approximately where Castle Junction is now. And so where the City Hall is now, that was the ornamental gardens of that castle. But in the 1780s, 1783 and 1785, this building here, the White Linen Hall, was built in that site. Of course, linen was the staple industry in the 18th century of North East Ulster. And it was a competition basically between Uri, Derry and Belfast as to whether a new linen centre for the commercial sale of linen should be. Belfast won out on that debate and argument. The late Robert Corbett used to talk about this debate greatly. Largely, I suppose Belfast won it because the Earl of Donegal, who was there, gave the land here for the building of this site, the White Linen Hall, built 1783 to 1785. And that building remained there until the 1890s. But increasingly during the 19th century, it wasn't being used for the purpose that it was built. It was built for the sale of white linen, bleached linen. But increasingly during the 19th century, it was being used by other commercial purposes and other activities as well. And the most notable being, the one that I find most interesting because of the amount of time I spent in the building, is the fact that the Linen Hall Library was actually in the City Hall for most of the 19th century. It didn't move out of the White Linen Hall for most of the 19th century. It didn't move out of the White Linen Hall until virtually it was being demolished in the 1890s to make way for the City Hall. But it makes the point about why the White Linen Hall was no longer being used for the purpose of its built. The land that the White Linen Hall stood on at the time when the talk about building the City Hall starts to emerge in the 1880s was this lady, Harriet Chichester, Countess of Shaftesbury, and she was the daughter of the third Marquess of Donegal. Now, her brother is the famous black man, the original black man statue that did stand where Henry Cook now stands in front of Ince, but who stands now in the City Hall itself. He had died, and this lady, Harriet Chichester, inherited most of the land in Belfast from her father. Now, when the talk of the City Hall, building the City Hall starts to emerge in the 1880s, she was actually opposed to the site being used for the City Hall. Again, harking back to what I was saying last week, the late 19th century was a period when public health was very much on the agenda. Public parks started to emerge. Botanic opened in 1869. And one thing or another, parks started to emerge throughout the city in the late 1880s, 1890s. And Harriet's view was that she would prefer that if the White Linen Hall was to be knocked down, that the area be used as a public park. This gentleman here, Charles C. Connor, former mayor of Belfast, he was also on the board of the White Linen Hall. And he used his influence over Harriet Chichester that they would allow the building, sell the site and allow the building of the new City Hall on the site. An interesting character in his own right, who ends up being a bankrupt himself. But another one of these great 19th century characters in Belfast who have been largely overlooked, and there's loads of the work needs to be done on, and he's probably one of them. But he persuades the sale of the site, and an Act of Parliament goes through in 1890, 25th of July 1890, for the sale of the White Linen Hall site for £30,000. So it sounds like nothing at the moment, but it's a huge amount of money in 1890. And on 3rd October 1894, a resolution is passed to build the City Hall on the site of the White Linen Hall. And Sir Samuel Black is the town clerk, and much to the annoyance of our former, just recently retired chief executive, I made a mistake one day in front of him and said, "This is the most influential town clerk stroke chief executive in Belfast I've ever had." Not being one that's overly ambitious, I thought I could take a risk. Just didn't want to be too far. But I would argue that Samuel Black is probably the most influential of the town clerks that Belfast has ever had. He's, I might be a bit biased, but I have to declare that, of course. He's born 1830 in Ballycastle, and he's educated initially privately and then at Foyle Londonderry College. And he's admitted as a solicitor in 1858. And when it comes to Belfast and opens a practice, the descendants of which are still going today, which we see C&J Black in Hall Street. But he's a conservative in politics, and he initially went into the corporation as a conservative councillor. Of course, you know, this is in the 1860s, or the days before unions and nationalists, when it was conservative or liberal. He went in as a conservative councillor, but then in 1870 he decides that his career lies in administration, and he becomes a town solicitor. And then later in 1878 he becomes the he becomes the town clerk. And this is the man who had the responsibility of overseeing the administration surrounding the building of the City Hall. But if you think about what I was saying last week and all the various things that were going on in Belfast, purchase of gas in the 1870s, purchase of the tramway system in 1904, new electric stations being built, this is the man who oversees all of this as the town clerk, and hence my view that he's such an important figure in late Victorian Belfast. Now we all know that the City Hall stands in Donegal Square, and I've just told you that the decision to build it there was taken on the 3rd of October 1894. But in the Belfast newsletter, note the date please, but don't be totally taken in by it. On the 1st of April 1897, this supplement appeared in the Belfast newsletter, drawn by W.J. Fennell, who was a Belfast City Councillor and a civil engineer, and Francis J. Bigger, who was a good Belfast character. And this drawing was recommending that the City Hall be built on a different site to where it is at the moment. And what they were recommending was that they knock down Inst. So those of you who went to Inst, I hope I haven't insulted you, but the proposal was that they knock down Inst and build the City Hall where Inst did stand, and thankfully maybe for some of you still stands. Okay? Now, why would this have been produced? Inst at the time was strapped for cash. Okay? So they wanted money. They needed money. There was talk around the same time of building St Anne's Cathedral. Now, we know where St Anne's Cathedral stands today. In this drawing is proposing that St Anne's Cathedral would go to the south side of Inst. And at the same time as all this was going on, there was talk of building the Royal Victoria Hospital, or building a technical college, or perhaps building a new academic institution for the one that you just had knocked down. In this drawing, it's academic institution shown here. The cathedral is shown here, and the City Hall, of course, with the statue of Queen Victoria in the middle, standing here. Now, it's the 1st of April, 1897. Is it an April Fool? I don't know. I don't think it was an April Fool. I think it partly made an April Fool, but I think it also was to generate debate, because one thing Belfast lacks, Belfast has great buildings, but there isn't actually that many of those sort of classical squares that you have in other cities throughout Europe, and being an industrial city, I suppose, part of the reason for it. Whether it was an April Fool or not, it was discussed in the council chamber in April 1897, but as one of my wisecracking friends said, it wouldn't be the first time there was a load of gas or hot air or nonsense or whatever words you want to use to describe discussed in the council chamber. But the truth of the matter is, it's interesting now for us to look back at it as a proposal. There's quite a lot of appealing features to it, but it's drawn the 1st of April 1897, and truthfully the decision was already made in 1894 where the City Hall was going. Money had been got from Parliament for it, and the instructions had been sent out by Black, the town clerk, for the competitors to tender for the work of building a new City Hall. But it is nonetheless an interesting sort of side to the story. There was 51 tenders for the building of the City Hall. And the architect chosen was, or his drawings that were chosen were Alfred Brumwell Thomas, and there's a huge collection of them here on display in the City Hall. He was 28 years of age from London, enormously young it appears to children when you're taking young kids around the City Hall or talking to young people. They look at you and you say 28, but of course in late Victorian times, if you were going to do anything, if you hadn't done it by the time you were 30, it was very unlikely you were going to do anything of that sort of magnitude. The assessors were Mr. Alfred Waterhouse. They were going to assess the tenders. He was president of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and he was responsible for the design of Manchester Town Hall. Those of you who know Manchester Town Hall will know it's a particularly impressive building, totally different style from Belfast. It's Gothic, totally different style from here. And the city surveyor J.C. Bretland, you remember, those of you here last week, that Bretland was the city surveyor who did the drainage works and some of the problems with flooding, but he also was responsible for the design of a lot of the buildings in Belfast, including St George's Market, in his own right. So Ronald Thomas was the architect selected, and this is one of the drawings from his archive that is now part of the Corporation Archive, his collection of drawings. It's classical Renaissance in style, very symmetrical. The features of the domes, the main dome in the middle, Portland stone, and thankfully lots of these drawings have survived, and Ian sitting here has had the displeasure of cataloguing an awful lot of them. A lot of them were used by the architectural historian Paul Lammer, and there's one of them currently on display in the record in the City Hall as well. Whenever Ronald Thomas later in life was asked about what the influences were on him, I think he shocked some people when he mentioned this building. This building is the, my Italian's not good, it's a 17th century church in Venice, Santa Maria della Salute. And he said these 17th century churches in Venice were an influence on me. I think this caught some people by surprise. Apparently he told this to descendants of St. J. Martin, who built the City Hall, were largely responsible for the City Hall. But I think we all know that the sort of major architectural style, of course he went on to say this as well, is the Sir Christopher Wren's St Paul's Cathedral of London. That was the sort of that style of architecture was very much in vogue in the late 19th century, and hence why you see a lot of buildings around the world that look like Belfast City Hall. The builders selected were St J. Martin, still going today in Belfast, thankfully. This is John Martin, who at that time was in charge of the firm. There's great stories sort of go about in the oral history that he used to sit in Robinson Cleavers across the road and have his lunch. It's now nice, some of us can go sit in Robinson Cleavers and have our lunch and discuss what was going on in the City Hall. So it's great that it's a local firm that is the main contractor for the City Hall. And the foundation stone was laid on the 18th of October 1898. They brought up from Dublin the Earl of Cadogan, the Lord Lieutenant, we'll call him the Queen's representative. It's not Secretary of State would be the closest thing nowadays to what the Lord Lieutenant was, or those of you can remember the old Governor of Northern Ireland, that sort of role. He comes up on the 18th of October to lay the foundation stone, tended by the Lord Mayor, Sir James Henderson. That's James Henderson of the Henderson Newsletter family, and the Town Clerk, Sir Samuel Black, architect Ronald Thomas, and of course the main contractor St J. Martin. And this story in its own way tells part of the story about the development of the City Hall and its expense. When Black issued the instructions for the competitors on the 20th of June 1896, he specified that there should be 125,000 spent on building the building and another 25,000 to furnish the building. And we will find out that it cost an awful lot more than that. And there was a couple of public boards of inquiry for the local government board, and whenever they were taking place, of course the councillors kept well away from it. They ushered in Mr. Black, the town clerk, to answer these difficult questions about why the expense was going up. And one of the questions focused on this foundation stone, because the foundation stone cost £500. And Black was going into some great detail. It's not just the foundation stone itself, the lovely Portland stone that it is. It's the whole event that went on. They this in the morning, they had a fine lunch in the Ulster Hall afterwards. There's only one photograph that I know, but it was survived at this event. And he was trying to make all this sort of justification of £500 that this had cost. Now, those of you who watch the parliamentary committees, the select parliamentary committees, will know how sarcastic some of these members of these committees can be. And one of them was heard to say under their breath whenever they found that it was £500, well, I hope it was a precious stone. but it was a piece of Portland stone. This is the most surviving photograph of that I know of the laying of the foundation stone. It's very, very poor quality. Because Henderson was a publisher, the year that he was Lord Mayor in 1898, he published a little book about his year as Lord Mayor, and in the middle of it, this photograph here now found this photograph, which we use in an exhibition when we do that. But it's not very good quality, but when you have nothing else, it has to do. But again, just going back to make the point that they weren't just talking about building the City Hall and designing the City Hall. You know, I said that Dublin comes up, they had a good lunch in the Ulster Hall. But that afternoon, you remember seeing this photograph last week, they went to open the East Bridge Street power station. So the building of City Hall has to be seen against what was going on in the municipal government in the city in its totality. So you know, that's very much the backdrop to it. The council, the corporation is increasingly playing a role in people's lives. And this is, you know, there's very few photographs of the City Hall actually being built. The best ones are in the Ulster Museum. But, you know, obviously there's a lot of works that went on, and so any photographs we picked of what the City Hall looked like as it was being built, we tried to include. This one, the City Hall was more or less finished, practically complete at the end of 1903, but of course it wasn't open to the 1st of August 1906. I would suspect this one was maybe 1905 maybe. But part of the reason why I like it so much is because of all the advertising around it. The herdman, who was a big industrial harbour commissioner and industry in Belfast, he complained, wrote to the city fathers to complain that you know, all the noise was scaring the horses and the dirt was scaring the horses, because Belfast was still very much a horse-drawn city at that time. And so as a result, this hoarding was put up. But again, the corporation not want to miss an opportunity to raise some money. Leased this out to the Belfast Advertising Company for the sum of £5,000, which was a lot of money at that time. And not just that I take interest in whisky. I always like this Korean pure malt whisky style here. But on a more serious note, we were looking for photographs of cleansing. And here we have an early cleansing vehicle going around the City Hall. I mentioned that ACJ Martin are the main contractors, but I think the point, it's great that it was a local firm that were the main contractor for the building contract, but I think the point that needs to be made is that the contractors included the best local firms as well as some of the best firms in Great Britain as a whole. So for just to pick a few and go down through them. The marble work, which anybody, I'm sure you've all been in the City Hall, if you haven't, I strongly urge that you go. The marble work is one of the most striking features of the City Hall. All brought in by a firm from London called Farmer and Brindley. Now, Farmer and Brindley had a huge interest in the history of marble. They just weren't interested in the commercial sale of marble. And they sourced a lot of the marble that's in the City Hall back to the marble that was used in classical Greece and Rome. And the most significant thing we say about the marble is, those of you who know it, the green columns up in the rotunda, that's Cipollina marble. Well, that marble was considered so unique that whenever it was on its way through London to come to Belfast, it was actually put on display in London so the hoi polloi of fashionable London society could actually see it. Stained glass is of course another great feature of the City Hall, and then on the other hand it was local firms, it was Warren Partners and Campbell Brothers, both Belfast firms who did that. Plaster work, the decorative plaster work in the City Hall was completed by George Rome, the company of Glasgow. Again, part of the reason why the expense of the City Hall was up more than originally estimated was when the City Fathers saw the first go decorative plaster work, they didn't think it was grand enough. The invoice for the first version of the plaster work was just over £2,000. Weren't happy with it, wanted more, wanted some redone. Second invoice was £5,000 more. So all of a sudden what was estimated at £2,000 is over £7,000. Marble, you know, Brummel Thomas when he's interviewed saying what made the City Hall was whenever the City Fathers agreed to let me put in more and more marble, if you end up spending £21,000 on marble alone. Electrical work, it lifts William Coates and Sons Belfast, very famous Belfast firm. I suppose that also highlights one of the points about the building. Although instead of architecture it's classical masons, it's very much harking back to the past. Inside the building that was compared with some modern features in terms of electric light, which was relatively new, lifts, which was relatively new, And I think the City Hall was the first building in Belfast to have its own telephone exchange. So there's that sort of modernity as well as harking back to that classical Renaissance style of architecture. The electric fittings, which I'm interested in, and we should play them later on, all the fine lights, they were J.W. Singer and Sons, and I'm sure all of you had Singer show machines in your homes at one time or other, and of course that's the same firm. But really the point I want to make is you have that combination of local and the best firms in Great Britain as well. One of the things that we were doing an exhibition for the Centennial of City Hall in 2006, I was interested in this firm here, H&H Martin, Cheltenham, and I could find out nothing about them. And it just shows you sometimes when you're in the middle of something, things happen by coincidence. And it just so happened in the blue, I received in the post this day a big parcel, and it was a copy of a book that a guy had written the history of the firm H&H Martin, and he just had realised that it's Centennial of City Hall, and he thought somebody might be interested in it. Just purely coincidentally, I never would have thought anything about them, other than the fact that he thought we might be interested. So Bromwell Thomas was the architect who gets all the credit for the fantastic look of the City Hall. That's if you like the building, a lot of people don't like the building, but fantastic look of the City Hall. Bromwell Thomas gets the view. But of course, Bromwell Thomas wasn't only responsible for overseeing the building of Belfast City Hall. At the same time, he's building Stockport and he's building Woolwich town halls. So he's a lot of the time in London. And as with a lot of these big jobs, the most maybe influential man on the site is the Clerk of Works. And this man, James Gamble, is the Clerk of Works overseeing the building of the City Hall. There's a descendant of his in the room, but I won't embarrass the lady in question. And Gamble, it has to be said, wasn't only the Clerk of Works on the building of the City Hall. At the same time, the City Hall has been built, with things like St George's Market is being built, and other municipal buildings are being built, so he's Clerk of Works on those as well. So Bromwell Thomas is in London, he's overseeing the work, he's on the site maybe 12 hours a day. Because he needs to communicate with Bromwell Thomas, we don't have text messages, we don't have mobile phones, he has to write to him on a very regular basis, maybe a daily basis. And there's a lovely quote where he says, the amount of correspondence and clerical work that otherwise I would not have to take, i.e. if Bromwell Thomas was here, not in London, I often have to work very long hours, often when I come home and I am often in very bad form. So I need a very clear distinction of how he feels a bit put upon. We know that he's having to do all this, but Bromwell Thomas is the man who history has recorded. But this is one of the unsung heroes of the City Hall. Certainly when we did the exhibition in 2006 of the building, we wanted to give him prominence, and the lady that I mentioned earlier very kindly produced this photograph out of the blue. We're doing exhibitions in the City Hall, and one of the things we do is keep staff involved. You send an email round saying, would anybody have anything, and most of the stuff you get, just be careful what you say, it's stuff that you know about, or it's very routine stuff. And then I was out doing something like this, and I came back, and it was an email for me. And there was I have a photograph you might be very interested in, and you're absolutely right. I was extremely interested in the photograph of James Gamble. This is one of the few photographs of what it looked like at the end of 1903. At that time, Bromwell Thomas is right in saying the building is largely complete. You can see the scaffolding around it. But it takes another 3 years basically before it's open to the finished and open. They're all public buildings even to this day, with exception of a few very notable exceptions. Was behind budget, over budget and behind schedule. But that's, a lot of kids particularly think, there must be lots of photographs of what it looked like when it was being built. And it's amazing, not so much now, but around 2006, how many queries I got, have you any photographs of workmen on the site doing the building? But that sort of photography comes, I think, a little bit later. Like for example, there's a great collection in the 1920s of workmen on the gasworks site, but we don't have the same for the building of the City Hall, unfortunately. The dome, of course, as I mentioned, is a very notable feature of the building. Of course, it's green because of the copper and the exchange of the atmosphere. The original plans was that it should be copper, but as they noticed the expense was starting to go up, Bromwell Thomas wanted to make a change this to lead. But the city fathers, again, no. The original drawing said copper. We're going to have it. We're going to have it with copper, and hence why we have that sort of aqua blue dome. Even before the building was opened, we had the first statue in the grounds, and this is one of the questions we like to try to do with groups when they're in the City Hall, is can you name the first statue in the City Hall? And of course everybody says Queen Victoria. But in actual fact, the first statue in the grounds is that of Sir Edward Harland of the shipyard. It's unveiled in June 1903. And a month later, in July 1903, Edward VII comes over to unveil the statue to Queen Victoria. Now, there's no evidence to suggest this, but this is why I partly base, my thing about the city's fathers knew the position they had in the world, and they wanted the City Hall to reflect not only Belfast's place in the world and what the corporation was doing for Belfast, but I also think there was an element about their place in the world, their place in the history of Belfast and their place in the world. Sometimes history is about interpretation, it's not all about what you can get evidence for, but I think there is certainly an element of that. But first statue was that of Sir Edward Harland. And when we come to the Queen Victoria statue, then Edward VII comes over for the unveiling of the statue in front of the City Hall, and here you see in the background the City Hall still under construction with very dapper William James Perry standing here, and H&J Martin standing in the middle, H. Martin standing in the middle. Now, Perry's positioning in that photograph is interesting because, I've said all along, Ronald Thomas designed the City Hall. City fathers had a big influence on what they wanted in this building, and that the budget goes up and up and up, and the project becomes well over budget. When it comes to the opening of the City Hall, there's a lot of talk about the cost of it, and these public inquiries are going on by the London Board. And Dixon, Sir Daniel Dixon, who was the Lord Mayor of Belfast when the City Hall opens in August 1906, was very quick to say, but of course the man with the big ideas was William James Perry. And undoubtedly, when you look through the improvement committee minutes of the building of the City Hall, Perry did have a huge influence. If you go on a tour of the City Hall now, they'll take you through the Lord Mayor's parlour, and they will draw out the maritime sort of influence within the Lord Mayor's suite of rooms. And certainly it's there, but I think it's more than that. I think that's just a bit populist. I think it's more than that. Basically, Perry's view was, if I'm building the best liners in the world, I also want the best City Hall in the world. Again, it goes back to where these people stood in the world and what they thought of themselves. But it's a picture of the unveiling of the statue of the City Hall in the background. I'm not going to go through all of these, say too much about them. I'm just picking out some of the architectural features that are all on the inside of the building. So the top last night was something completely different. And the guy who was giving the talk was saying, trying to get people to look up. And this is very suitable. This is from the pediment on the front, the exterior of the City Hall, with fine carving by Purdy and Millard, Belfast firm again. The marble, which we've already touched on, you all recognise these, I'm sure. I'm not going to say very much about them. This is the Cipollino marble here. This is actually a photograph from the book that was published for the opening of the City Hall on 1st of August 1906. Cipollino, this is the green marble, but I like the black and white photograph from the areas where the book, that doesn't do it justice. It looks better on the screen here. Again, very fine sculpture work, trying to get people to look at these fine carvings and carving work. In terms of money, I just took a note of working out because I can't remember the figure. It was almost £10,000 spent on carving sculpture work alone, so that's a huge amount of money at that time. And then, of course, going back to my interest in archives, this is the bill for the marble work to Farmer and Brindley. Marble work at the new City Hall, £11,500. So to the improvement committee that oversaw the money. Plaster work, this was a photograph that was taken in 2006 as part of the exhibition. The City Hall has been repainted entirely after the renovation work that was done then, 2007, 2008. Thankfully, the colours I think are now more in keeping with what the City Hall would have looked like when it was built. These are very much sort of 1970s and 1980s gaudy colours, for want of a better phrase. But they've gone back to up into the dome. But they've gone back more to what it looks like. Those of you who know that photograph know that was looking right up into the dome, up into the Bushburn Gallery. The dome itself is 175 metres high. The Bushburn Gallery and stained glass up in the Bushburn Gallery, bits of the coat of arms of the city and the 12 signs of the Zodiac. And top of the plasterwork, that's the invoice, the first invoice for the plasterwork, which was £3,300. Some pictures of stained glass, some of these you'll be very familiar with. I think the great thing with stained glass is that the original stained glass models were all two local firms. I think that needs to be emphasised.
A lot of new stained glass in the building now. This was not an original one, but this is the one put in to cover the colour on the rotunda. Colour, I suppose, if anybody in terms of corporation history or municipal history is there to take on Mr. Belfast, it's him. He's the Lord Mayor more than anybody else. He's Lord Mayor briefly for a couple of years during the First World War, but he was back in 1929. In 1942 he stands down, but the man who replaced him as Lord Mayor dies within 10 months, and McCulloch comes back and stays there in 1946. So he has a major influence, sometimes good, sometimes not so good, during that sort of the whole interwar period and during the war. This is one of the more modern stained glass windows. This is the family window. It's put in the last 10 years or so. And then we come to the electrical layers. Whenever the City Hall was being built, I mentioned at the very start that the gasworks, Province's gasworks, paid for the bulk of the building of the City Hall. And then, of course, when it came to decide how the City Hall should be lighted, there was a debate as to whether it should be by gas or whether it should be this newfangled source of power, electric. And the Belfast City Council traditions, they had a bit of a compromise initially, and there was a bit of both, but eventually, obviously, electric was the fall of lighting. And this lovely phrase, an electrical ear, which basically was very much an Edwardian time. And whenever Betchen did his series of Belfast and his documentary in the City Hall, he particularly drew attention to these. Now, there is one or two original electrical ears still in the City Hall, but most of them were destroyed during the Blitz in 1941, particularly in the Great Hall. Because thankfully the big stained glass windows in the Great Hall, the stained glass windows in the City Hall were taken out before the Blitz, but the lights weren't. But as part of Project Ian, I'm involved in the archive project, a lot of these drawings all started to come to attention, and the City Hall had the replicas made of these lights in the Great Hall. They're all computer controlled, but at least they look much more like what the original electrical ears did, rather than the horrible 1960s and 70s lights that come in the building for a long time. That's one of the modern ones there. Not exact, but it's much more in keeping with what the lights look like. Just the carving, I mentioned H&J Martin, not H&J Martin, H&H Martin from Cheltenham. Probably the best examples of the carving is the Lord Mayor's chair. When you're taking groups around the City Hall, one of the things that tends to get overlooked, people's eyes immediately go to the marble, they go to the plasterwork, but the quality of the oak carving, particularly in the council chamber, is outstanding, but also in the reception halls as well, particularly I think that's just some of the quality of the carving the H&H Martin Cheltenham did. So then we come to the opening of the building on the 1st of August 1906. The Lord Mayor, Sir Daniel Dixon, he had been Lord Mayor I think for 5 terms by this stage, hugely influential in Belfast, and the City Fathers were very keen that they have a royal visitor to open the City Hall. Now, Edward VII had been over to unveil a statue to his mother in July 1903, and it became very clear they weren't going to get a royal visitor. There wasn't as many royal visits in those days, of course, as we've become more used to in the late 20th and early 21st century. But there was some disappointment that the City of Belfast standing, with its new fine building, did not have a royal visitor. And there was a very interesting cartoon appeared in a journal called Nomad's Weekly. I don't have a copy of it in this presentation, but I'll try and describe it to you. Where Nomad's Weekly was a sartorial magazine which makes private eye look sort of tame, to be honest with you. They had no qualms about gutting the public figures in Belfast life. In the Hall Library, some copies of it. And this picture appears of Daniel Dixon, the Lord Mayor, standing looking at a poster, or maybe on an easel at the railings of the City Hall, basically of this new City Hall, and a sign, wanted, important person, particularly with royal connections, to come and open our City Hall and confer some honours upon us. So they would all gain back the status of these people and who they thought they were, where their place was in the world. But there was no royal visit to the City Hall, and they had to make do with the then Lord Lieutenant. Duggan had moved on, then there at Aberdeen, and he comes to Belfast to unveil or to open the City Hall on a wet 1st of August 1906. And immediately attracted a lot of attention. This is a photograph of Alexander Hogg lying on his back, taking a photograph up into the dome of the City Hall. But it wasn't only people like Hogg who made their way to the City Hall in its early days. There was, to coincide with the opening, a small tour guide facility put together, and people came to visit the newly opened City Hall. I was working on the exhibition in 2006 for the centenary. I got a message one day, there was a lady in reception. I went down, and her very, very, very elderly lady, and her father, as a young Presbyterian from Donegal, her father, as a young Presbyterian minister, had been coming to Belfast for one of his first General Assembly meetings in Belfast in 1906. It was early 1907, and he had come to, as part of his trip to Belfast, big thing, coming from rural Donegal to Belfast, wasn't going to do it every day, very often, and he came to have a look round and to a little extract in her diary about his visit. So it wasn't just William Alexander Hogg or the High Boy of Belfast. All the people were coming to see the City Hall as well. And the opening, this article appeared to coincide with it in the Belfast Telegraph. You remember I said that whenever Black sent out his estimates for tenders, it was to be £125,000 to build, £25,000 to furnish. This is the 1st of August 1906, the day of the opening, and according to the Telegraph, the total cost was over £300,000. So while there was delight with the new building, there also was, this is well over budget than what was originally intended. We've talked about some of the reasons for that, and we'll talk a bit more about it now. In actual fact, the Telegraph was quite generous. The total cost was actually over £360,000, and £60,000 then is a lot more than what £60,000 is worth now. So, there was a lot of pride in this new building by most people. There were some critics, it has to be said. There remain some critics of the City Hall. I think there's fewer now than there used to be. But some people say it's far too ornate. But well over budget, and as I said earlier, behind budget. Whenever City Palace had bought the ground from Harriet Chichester for the £30,000 to knock down the White Lynn Hall and build the City Hall, her condition had been that she'd always wanted to be a public park, so her condition was that the grounds of the City Hall should look like gardens. So this photograph taken, I think, about 1910 would tend to suggest that in the early days, before we had as many statues as it's now in the grounds, that the grounds of the City Hall did very much fulfill what her wish was, that it would look more like gardens, quite formal gardens. You see Queen Victoria's statue and Harlow's statue at the far end where it was then. Did definitely, in the early days at least, keep their word to her. This is the man who designed the gardens. He's Charles McKim. He was the chief superintendent of parks at this time, and he was the man who was responsible for the design and building of the tropical ravine some years earlier at Botanic Gardens. But again, making the point that they weren't just building a City Hall. This is December late 1905. I showed this photograph as well last week. This is the laying tracks in Royal Avenue, Donegal Street, York Street. So again, it's not just about building a City Hall, it's about providing more and improved services for the people of Belfast, people who live in Belfast, working in Belfast. And I think you've got to see the City Hall and the building of the City Hall in that context. I might go on about who the City Fathers were, and I might go on about Belfast's place in the world. Another big factor of it is that the corporation at those days was playing a major role in people's lives. But they were, no doubt, conscious of their place in the world. And leading into what I want to talk about next week, as soon as the City Hall was opened in 1906, the focus of Belfast shifts. Prior to building the City Hall, the focus of Belfast is the area like around the Harbour Office, around the Customs House, and the old bits of Belfast High Street, Waring Street, that part of it. But as soon as the City Hall is built, the focus of Belfast switches, and we're going to talk next week about things that happen at the City Hall, so we'll explore that a bit more. But this is at the front of the City Hall, just contemporary with when the City Hall was being built. It was City Hall just wasn't built on that site. All the streets around there were redeveloped, widened, made significantly wider. And part of the reason for that was A, because the City Hall was now there to give it that grandeur. It was also to do with the development of Belfast, but it's also to make the point that the City Hall wasn't the only building being built at that time. Contemporary in that area, contemporary with built the City Hall, you had the Scottish Province building, still there today, opened in 1902, from memory. You have this building here, initially called the Ocean Building. This is the Slough Marks Dispensers, Robert Corbett here. This is a new building that opened again, contemporary with around the same time as the City Hall. Behind the City Hall, where the Nationwide Building Society is now at the corner of Dublin Road, that was the Scottish Temperance Building, another assurance company. So this whole area is being developed at that time. The Robson and Cleavers was built in the 1870s, so it's already there. Okay. This whole area around the square, which had been largely, up until the mid-19th century, residential, then as people, the wealthy of the city, wanted to move out into the suburbs, into Sydenhams and Strandtowns and Hampton Road, Malone Road, it becomes more commercialised. And then in the time of the City Hall, late 1890s, 1900s, you start to see these big prominent buildings being built in the focus of the city moving towards where we sort of see it now at the City Hall. That will remain there and not going to see full development around Belfast, but for most of the 20th century, that's definitely what the focus of the city was. That's where you went to celebrate and protest and everything else, and we'll explore that next week. But I also make these points for another reason, that when the City Hall was being built, an article appeared in the Telegraph that saying that these buildings were going up and they were going to be bigger than the City Hall, that they were going to be looking down on the City Hall. In fact, they went further to say that it looks like that the City Hall has sunk into a hole. And so the decision was taken to raise the height of the City Hall by 5 feet in the middle of building the City Hall. Now, there's somebody like me who's, I don't want to describe myself, I would say artist with all the better word than that, records manager. Building a something extended by 5 feet, innocent country boy like myself, so that's just another couple of row of blocks, you know, until you talk to a civil engineer and they explain to you what impact it has on a building and the expense of a building of increasing it by 5 feet. A building of this scale, for example, one of the things that the result of that decision was that they had a steel floor in some places which cost £1,000. £1,000 a day is nothing, unless you happen to be a poor public official. But in terms of a big public building, you know, but in those days it's an awful lot of money, has a huge impact. And that was because of this article. You know, these buildings were looking down, and you know, even as late as the 60s and 70s in Belfast, there were very few buildings, if any, that were taller than the City Hall. You know, they didn't want buildings looking down, and they certainly didn't want them looking down on it in 1900. You know, they saw themselves as the city fathered and all, so it was increased. But that's one of the reasons why it went so over budget. It's got to do with the geography of around here, the redevelopment of around here, not wanting anybody, no building to be bigger than. But there's other reasons, like we touched on some of them. I want to just cover a couple more. You'll all be very aware of the grand marble staircase when you go into the City Hall. There's also a staircase on the east side of the Belfast Square east side, but not as grand, but still a grand staircase, not in the original drawings. You have a balcony in the Great Hall, not in the original drawings. You know, so all these things add on, more marble than was intended. So you have all these things being added on that add to the expense of the building. And there's some reasons suggested for that. One of the reasons is that during the building of the City Hall there's a change in the number of councillors, and they come in. So they come in 1896, 1898. So the previous generation of councillors have approved the drawings. You have more of these councillors as well, and they want their influence on the building too. They want it to be grand, and that's one of the things. But there's also, I think, this big thing just about where they saw themselves in the world, or where they saw Belfast in the world. Now, 360,000 roughly is what it cost to build the City Hall. In today's money, that was £128 million. we were told in 2006. Okay. So they've left us a landmark building, there's absolutely no doubt about that. It does have its critics, among them some notable architectural storing. But I think in fairness, at least we have a building that has stood the test of time. It is probably the single, well, before the Titanic Museum was open, or Titanic Building was probably the most visited building in Belfast. And it still is very much the focus of municipal life. Next week I want to talk about things that happened at the City Hall. Not so much the politics of it, what happened in the City Hall. In fact, not the politics of what happened in the City Hall, but more about how the City Hall becomes a focus for protests, celebrations and events in the history of the city, and in some way it tells a lot of the history of the city. And that's where I'd like to end today. I'm happy to take some questions.